And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Anita Stewart, retired registered nurse who at the age of 35 had a near-death experience which forever changed her perspective on life. Anita, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's really an honor to be here and to share my story with your audience.
Well, we're excited to have you. If you don't mind, let's start on the day you died and go from there.
Okay, well, I died on January 17th, 1989. And I'm going to back up just a tiny bit because there's a few things that are important to kind of weave into the story of the actual near-death experience. So I lived on a ranch, a horse ranch in Agua Dulce, California, and I was bit on the ankle by a bug, a flea, and within days I had very high fever, nausea, body aches, and went to the emergency room. I hadn't eaten for 4 days. Couldn't eat, and so I was an ER nurse at the time, and I went to the ER where I worked. And my friend, the doctor, said, "I'm going to give you fluids, send you home. If you get worse, come back." And sure enough, the next day, I was much worse, and I ended up calling 911. And so I was taken to the emergency room and very promptly admitted. I ended up with a fever as high as 105. I couldn't breathe. I had the horrible body aches, the nausea, the vomiting. And they admitted me, I think it was the 16th. And I went downhill so rapidly. They called in an infectious disease consult and a pulmonary consult. And by the time I was going downhill, my husband at the time was at my bedside. And the doctors had decided, because they couldn't find what was causing my lungs to fill up with fluid, but very quickly on chest x-ray, I had a complete whiteout, which means my lungs were completely filled with fluid. And I had what's known as adult respiratory distress syndrome, ARDS, which is about 95% fatal. And so because they had done all these tests and nothing had come back, nothing was positive. They ran me for Legionnaire's disease, for hantavirus, for every kind of pneumonia possible, and nothing came back positive. And they just kept loading me with antibiotics, but my fever just continued to climb. And finally, I got to a point where I was hallucinating and I couldn't breathe at all. My oxygen saturation was in the 40s. So I was going downhill rapidly, and the only thing they could think to do was take me into surgery and do what's called an open lung biopsy and hope to find something that was causing this. So as I was rolling into surgery, my husband was holding my hand, and I looked up into his eyes, and I remember saying very specifically, "I'm going to die." I knew I was going to die. And by the time they got me into the OR, I had gone into a respiratory arrest, and they intubated me. And that is when, I believe that was when, because it's hard to say, I had my near-death experience. And I have to say it was very important to say this to your audience. About 2 or 3 days before I got sick, my husband and I, he was a wonderful man, I mean, a loving man, but we were kind of growing apart and going down different paths. And because he was so loving and so wonderful, I just could not imagine what it would feel like to have to go through a divorce. So I was talking with my girlfriend, and I emphatically said to her, "I would rather die than go through a divorce." And I wanted to just let your audience know to be careful what you speak, because I ended up dying. And I honestly, at some point, I feel like I may have created that from that intense angst that I was experiencing. But So my experience, the near-death experience itself, it's what I say is it's ineffable. It's so difficult to put into words because the words we use to describe love don't even, they're pale in comparison to what I experienced. So what I remember, what I recall very vividly is being out of my body, and I was just simply a point of awareness in this vast, infinite space. And there were colors and lights. And then I hear a voice, and it was a man's voice. And he spoke with me, and he said, Anita, my child, you have to make a decision now, whether you want to live or whether you want to die. And what was so interesting was I was feeling completely comforted and loved so deeply, and in this sense of absolute bliss. I mean, the bliss was, um, it was, it was amazing. I did not want to leave. And I said, well, I don't want to leave here. And I remembered at that point, it came to me that I had this angst that was going on around, whether I wanted to leave my husband. And I was like, no, I want to stay here. And suddenly, and everything happens instantly. I mean, like in a nanosecond. And in a nanosecond, I saw my whole life flash in that, like that. It was everything from when I was a baby, when I was a child, when I first started riding horses and going to Disneyland. It was just like everything just happened. But at the same time, I mean, seeing my whole life like that, and then, but getting it. I mean, I got the whole picture in a nanosecond. And I looked at that and I said to myself, I have a wonderful life. I want to live. And it was in that instant, I remember just flying backward. And then I crashed into my body and I was in ICU. And I remember opening my eyes and having chest tubes and being ventilated on a ventilator. And I think it was probably a matter of 2 days or more that I was having the near-death experience. Because when I opened my eyes, um, I looked around and I was like completely shocked and surprised that I was where I was. And what had happened while I was having my near-death experience is the doctors called a family conference because my kidneys had shut down completely. My liver had shut down. I was in very high numbers for hepatitis. And the doctors still did not know what I had. They had no diagnosis to run, to treat me with. And so for me, it was like waking up in my body, and suddenly I'm like, oh, I'm I'm back. I'm here. And then over a matter of days, it was about a week on the ventilator. But meanwhile, the day that I was in surgery and had the arrest, the doctors called a family conference, and they only do that when they want to make a decision to pull somebody off of life support. And so they sat my whole family down and said, we don't know what she has. We don't know how to treat her. And she could be on the ventilator for months, just being kept alive. But her kidneys are shutting down, her liver is shutting down, and she's dying. So we want to know if you'd like us to take her off life support and pull the plug, essentially. And my family refused. They said no. But it was at that time, and so it was sometime later, maybe a day or so later, that I popped back in my body. I probably appeared quite dead. I happened to work at that hospital in the emergency room, so I was known by quite a few people there. And what it was, Holy Cross Hospital in Mission Hills, California, and the nurses, it's a Catholic hospital, and the nurses taped my name under the statue of the Virgin Mary for lost causes. So when I came back with this joy, with this absolute, like, I'm back, I'm here, I want to live. And it was just this immense joy and excitement to be alive. And then I remember when they first rolled me out of the hospital, all the colors of the trees and the birds and the sounds of the crickets and everything was just magnified, like I had this intense way to tune in to everything. Everything was beautiful. And I actually had just this change of heart about staying married with my husband. So, I mean, my near-death experience was profound because what made it so profound was I realized that I'm not a body, that I'm pure awareness. And that awareness was 360 degrees. I mean, everywhere. I could see up, down, all around, under, over, backwards, forwards. It was like, wow. It was mind-blowing, absolutely mind-blowing, Jeff. And I didn't see anybody. I saw lights, but I didn't see a body. And the voice that spoke to me was the most loving and gentle voice I've ever heard. You know, I don't know if I would say it was God, but it was something that I will never forget. That love, that deep, 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 intense acceptance, love. Yeah, I'll never forget that voice. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Thank you for sharing your experience with us. Once you did come back to your body, how fast did it take you to recover physically?
Oh, it was so fast. I mean, here I was pretty much dead, other than the ventilator. And it was a matter of, I think, 2 or 3 days. And I was transferred out of ICU. And then it was a matter of another few days and I was home. And I healed. They actually named me the miracle nurse at Holy Cross Hospital. And what's really interesting, so I used to work through the registry and I worked at different hospital emergency rooms. And one day I was working at the Veterans Hospital where they see, all kinds of crazy diseases and things, county hospital, big hospital. And there was a doctor and she says, "Oh, aren't you that nurse that died and came back?" And I said, "Yeah." And she says, "Oh man, I want to hear all about that." And so I was recounting. She said, "I want to hear all about it. I want to hear what your symptoms were, how fast you had each symptom." And so I said, "Well, I remember very well being bit on the ankle by like a flea. And I remember it being very, very, very irritating. And it got very, very red and itchy and sore. And then I went through, and she said, "Well, how long before you started the fever? How long before you started nausea? How long before the body aches?" And she said to me, Anita, you had plague, pneumonia. You had the bubonic plague. And I was like, are you kidding? And she said, no. And she goes and grabs the infectious disease book and brings it out and shows it to me. And she says, look. And I'm reading it. And I mean, it was step by step, exact days, exact timing. And then I went back to my doctor on a follow-up visit. And I said to him, Dr. Ito, I think I had plague. And he said, well, that's the only thing we didn't test you for because the causative agent is Yersinia pestis. And in order to test for that, it has to go to the CDC, and it's a very dangerous test to perform because of the contagiousness. And so they didn't test for that. But both my doctors, the pulmonary specialist and the internist that I followed up with, I showed them, I took copies of the book and I said, look, this is what I had. And they both agreed wholeheartedly. They said, oh, yeah, you have plague. And I lived on a ranch that was on the backside of the national forest, the Angeles National Forest. And so I was on the backside. And at the time, they were having an outbreak of the plague and they had the forest closed. So I died. I tell people I died of the plague.
That's amazing. I didn't know the plague still exists.
Oh, yes, very much so. It's carried by squirrels and, chipmunks and squirrels and ground, a lot of the ground animals, rats, mice. Yeah. And it was really interesting because I know um, the hantavirus was also going around. And so they ran me for the Hanta and Legionnaires, and they ran every test in the book. I ended up, when I was back at the hospital where I worked, when I went back to work, I ended up getting, of course, in those days, it was all paper charting. It wasn't the, electronic medical records we have today. But in those days, it was paper charting. So I went and got my chart and made copies of all the progress notes. And I remember reading through them. I had all these progress notes from the doctors, and reading through them. This one page says difficult case, unable to pinpoint causative agent, and it was said it was said in the progress notes like 2 or 3 days in a row how difficult the case was. And all I can say is I chose to live. And it was like in making that choice, I healed.
What I think is fascinating is also that, you wanted to die. So people should be
Yeah.
careful what they wish for.
I'm going to add something to this. So I want your listeners to really take this in. So I moved away from the ranch. I stayed with my husband for 5 years. And we started having, because when I came back, I was so loving. I mean, nothing could upset me. Nothing bothered me. I accepted everything just as it was. But we continued to kind of go different ways. I had so much more of a spiritual journey, and his was more, let's go to Vegas and go gambling and drinking and driving fast in my Porsche. And nothing bad about that, but that wasn't for me. I was really pulling away from all that materialism. And I mean, I was really just, floating through life, happy and at peace and content. And then come January, so I died on January 17th of 1989. So 5 years later, my girlfriend, who was a healer from Sedona, Arizona, big, huge woman, she was one of these people who healed the planet through holding the space for the ley lines and holding the light. She lived in Sedona, and she decided to come and visit me. So she arrived at my house on the night of January 16th, 1994. And we laid in the backyard. I had a beautiful pool. I lived in Northridge. I lived up in Porter Ranch. And we were laying around the pool and it was a very warm January night. I mean, I remember how warm it was. And so the night went on, and then she says, "Well, I'm tired. It was a long drive. I'm going to go to bed." And then something happened. I had a two-story house, and I was up on the balcony, and I had a friend with me, and she came up on the balcony with me, and we were looking out over the backyard and the pool, and all of a sudden, this huge wind came up, and we both screamed because it came up suddenly out of the blue. We both screamed, and we jumped into the house, and we almost broke the sliding glass door down trying to get in. So we finally, and she was so afraid. She says, "Anita, I'm not sleeping upstairs tonight. I don't know what's going on, but something horrible is going to happen." And I tried to calm her down. I said, "It's okay, it's okay." We went to bed. She stayed downstairs and slept downstairs in the living room. And all of a sudden at 4:30 in the morning on January 17th, we had the Northridge earthquake. And my house was red tagged. I mean, it literally went, I was thrown out of the bed, across the room. I thought I was going to die. I thought it was the end of the world. But I want to back up a little bit. When Christine and I were having that conversation at the pool, I was telling her, I've tried, I've been in therapy, I've gone to counseling. I don't know what it is, but I just don't feel like I can put up with my husband anymore. I said, "I'm so angry at the way he does this, and I'm so angry." And I swear to God, I caused that earthquake from my anger. But yeah, it was, and it was at that point after we had to vacate the house that we went our separate ways, you know, with love. But it was a good thing.
What other spiritually transformative experiences have you had?
You're good, Jeff. I love you.
Thank you. I love you too.
So I think the most important one to me, I mean, the near-death experience was profound and really changed my life. But what even changed my life more than that was back in 1981. I was living in Chatsworth, California. I had a half-acre ranch. I had a couple horses, trail horses, and we lived a few blocks from the hills, and we would go riding. My husband and I would go riding, and all of a sudden, I'm putting my boots on, and in my mind's eye, like a movie playing in my mind's eye, I see this movie, and I'm riding my horse, and he trips and goes tumbling down a hill like a cliff, and he rolls on me, and he breaks my back, and I'm laying there unable to move. And the next thing in this movie, in my mind's eye, is I see this helicopter land, and it's coming to pick me up because my back is broken and I can't walk. And when it lands, it says Los Angeles County. And I went, this can't be possibly true because I live in LA City. So I disregarded the premonition and I went riding. And my husband and I started to take off in a canter on the horses. And my horse just suddenly bucked, like a buck I've never seen before. I mean, he went straight up in the air. He catapulted me down. I hit a rock, a big, huge rock with my head, and I fractured my skull. I broke my scapula, which is the hardest bone in the body to break. I broke my back and I couldn't move my legs. And I'm laying there. I was awake. The horses ran off to a ranch close by. And so pretty soon riders came. My husband was comforting me, trying to keep me comfortable because my back was severe, severe pain. And so they called a helicopter to get me. And when it landed, it was Los Angeles County helicopter. So little did I know that when you go up into the mountains, it turns into the county. So I became a trauma patient at the trauma center where I worked at Northridge Hospital Trauma Center. And they flew me in, and I had to be rehabilitated to walk, severe pain. So what happened was when they discharged me home after about 2.5 weeks of rehabbing in the pool and getting to the point where I could walk because my spinal cord was swollen. One of my girlfriends that worked with me in the ER, she decided to bring a little book over for me to read because I was very, very angry. I was like, how can this happen to me? I mean, what did I do to deserve this? And she brings this little book over. She was my spiritual girlfriend, and it was a book called Quiet Talks with the Master by Eva Bell Werber. And she says, I want you to read this book, and I want you to really concentrate and focus on the messages and the pages. So I started reading. I was in my recliner chair. And you have to understand, I couldn't move without my husband moving me. I couldn't lean forward enough to even wipe myself on the toilet. Poor guy, he had to do everything. And so we had this big grandfather clock, and had a pendulum tick-tock. And I'm reading this page. I was home alone. My husband was working. And I'm home alone in my recliner, and I open up the page. It says, "Be still and hear my voice." I was like, all right, God, you want to talk to me? You need to make that pendulum stop ticking. Suddenly, it was like I was in this silence chamber. The pendulum was moving, but there was absolutely no sound whatsoever. And I was like, oh my God. And I hear this voice, and it was very loving. And it said, my child, you have many questions, and I'm here to answer them for you. And I'm like, so I think it was Jesus. I was raised Catholic, but I was a rebellious Catholic because the Monsignor called me a pagan because my skirt was too short. So I was like, eh. I was a rebellious Catholic. So, but I think it was Jesus that came to me. At least I believe that. But, you know, it was a voice. And he said, let me answer your questions for you. And I started to think of all these questions that we have about life, like what is my purpose? Why am I here? What am I doing here? And what am I supposed to do? And what is the meaning of life? But every question that popped into my mind before even one word was formulated, the answer was there, and the answer was there, and the answer was there. And I had this conversation, and I was told, you've come here for a purpose to heal, to help heal the planet and to awaken the planet. And I'm like, well, what do I need to study? Well, what do I need to do? And what books do I need to read? What classes do I need to take? And he said, you need do nothing but get your ego and your personality out of the way, and we will do the healing work through you. I'm like, wow. And suddenly it's like all the anchor lifted. And all of a sudden I had this intense feeling of joy come over me. And so I had incredible clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience suddenly, which I haven't really had before at this level, but it was intense. When the phone would ring, I would know who it was calling. And what was so funny is I called my husband. He was at work. I called my husband. I said, honey, Jesus came and visited me and talked to me. And of course, he thought I was nuts because I fractured my skull, although I was never unconscious, but I had a basilar skull fracture. So for about a year, I was led, guided, and directed by this beautiful, loving voice, who I call Jesus. And everything was just like given to me. And so I was told to get a healing table. And I was told to invite my girlfriends to come and lay on the table. And I said, well, what am I supposed to do? And they just said, you just need to get out of the way. I'm like, well, don't I need to know? But no, you don't need to know. There's nothing you need to know. And so my girlfriend Rachel came over. She's a nurse. And I put her on my table and I said, Rachel, I have no idea, but I need some guinea pigs. Now I told her what had happened. And so she gets on my table, and the next thing I know, it's like I'm taken over by this energy, and my hands start moving. And I mean, I don't even know where they're going or what they're doing or why they're doing it. But all of a sudden, I'm feeling the energy and I'm feeling some stuckness. And I get down to her pelvis. And all of a sudden, I got this vision of like tar, sticky tar. So I was working and working and working on this tar and kind of getting it unstuck. And I said, Rachel, you have endometriosis. Of course, they're not my words. They're not Anita's words. They're coming through me. She goes, no, I don't. And I said, yeah, you do. She goes, no, I don't. Well, she hadn't have been menstruating for about 2.5 months. And she said, well, that's interesting because I haven't had my period for 2.5 months. I'm like, well, let me work on this. So I kept working. She went home. She called me the next morning and she said, Anita, I got my period at 2:30 in the morning last night, whatever you did. So about 2 weeks later, she went to the doctor and he diagnosed her with endometriosis. That was my first experience with energy medicine and hands-on healing. So I started working on more people, and over the years, it just developed. And I really stand in awe of what comes through because people have amazing transformations. I had one fellow who came who was supposed to fly to some family gathering, and he says, I can't get on a plane. I have a phobia of flying. I have a panic attack. I said, well, come over and get on the table. Let's see what happens. And he got over his fear of flying in one session. I had, and the other thing that's so interesting was, even though I wasn't, I kind of knew a little bit about energy medicine, but I had never really taken any classes or read any books. And then, of course, I was getting more and more curious because things were happening I couldn't explain. And of course, the nurse in me, that left brain Anita, said, I want to know what I'm doing. I want to know what's happening here. So little by little, I started doing some studying. And I actually, one of the places I was led, guided, and directed to be was at the Ebell Theater. And I started studying the Course in Miracles with Marianne Williamson. She was amazing. I mean, I actually had her home phone number and would call her and say, I don't understand this and I don't understand that. But I have to say that, so during that 1 year that Jesus was speaking to me and teaching me and showing me and coming through me, all of a sudden one day I woke up and all of the clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience was taken away. It was gone. Like, boom. I'm like, oh my God, what happened? And the voice, and he came to me and he said, now you know what's possible. Now you know what you can do. And now you need to do the work to clear out everything that blocks you from doing it. And so that put me on this very, very deep dive into really just releasing, surrendering the ego. I was looking for every which way to do it. So I did a course in miracles. I did Earnest Home, Science of Mind. I actually sat with Louise Hay in her apartment living room with a room full of AIDS patients and learned about how to heal your body from Louise Hay. Yeah, it took me on some amazing, it took me into amazing places. So I have I kept asking, what do I call this? And they said, do not label it, because I heard people doing Reiki and Donna Eden and this and that. And I said, well, what do I call this? Because I hadn't been trained in any of those modalities. And they said, you just call it the work. That's all. And that was before Byron Katie took that on. So Byron Katie has something called the work. But so that was my passion and my gift that I still use today. I have a private practice. I work out of my home. And what I have found is that people are just led and guided to come. I don't really work on neophytes. Usually they call me people who know me well. They call me the healer's healer because I do a lot of work with people who are in the healing profession, who are, energy medicine practitioners, masseuses, therapists of some sort. So, and the work is all done by donation. I asked what, people always say, well, you have to charge. And I asked, well, what should I charge? And Spirit said, you can't put a price on waking people up. You you need to work by donation. And I said, well, how am I going to support myself? And they said, you'll always have what you need. You'll always be supported. And so I trusted that. And so when people come, I just tell them, I want you to have this. They go, well, how much is this going to cost me? And I said, well, you're going to find out when the session is over. I want you to drop into your heart and ask your heart what's appropriate, because money is relative. I mean, you may not be able to afford $50. You may be able to afford 500. I don't know. It's all relative, but it's not about the money for me. It's about you getting this work done. And I want you to have a direct experience and know who you are as pure consciousness, pure awareness, because you're not your body. You're not your identity. You're not who you are as a mother, a teacher, a nurse, a doctor. That's not who you are. You're so much more. And why limit yourself? So most of my clients have one session and have big transformations. It's been really powerful work, and it just comes through, and I actually I'm a witness. I just allow myself to be used. The words that come out of my mouth are not mine. Sometimes my voice changes. And sometimes I know at one point there was a group, they called themselves the Celts, and they said they were a band of energy beings. And I mean, they were hilarious. They would come through. Oh, can I share a story about something?
Sure.
So one day I had a friend of mine who's a nurse, and she's been carrying a lot of shame and guilt because when she was younger, she blames herself for her little brother dying. She was supposed to be babysitting and watching him, and they had a pond, and he went out into the pond and drowned. And then she's been carrying this shame and guilt. And I said, well, let's work on that, Dawn. Let's just work on that. So she came over and we did a session, and the Celts came through. And the Celts have this, Irish brogue that they speak with. And she said, and she was laying there on the table. We were kind of working through the energy centers around her heart and her solar plexus. And the words were coming through. And you have to understand, I don't usually recall much of what goes on in the healing room, because it just stays there when I walk out of that room. I don't bring it with me, and I don't carry it with me. I don't need to know. But for some reason, this particular session was extremely impressive. So we got her to a point where she actually went through quite a bit of crying and releasing the guilt and the shame and the energy around the feeling and the belief that she killed her brother. And we got her past that. And she finally got to a point where felt very relieved, and she felt like this opening and this clearing. And then the Celts come out they're looking at her and they go, so now, is there anybody else you killed that you want to work through? And she's like, well, as a matter of fact, but they said it with such a joking manner. So is there anybody else you killed that you want to work through? It's like, oh my. But she had a girlfriend that she felt guilty about, because her girlfriend said, let's go hitchhiking and let's hitchhike. And she said, no, I'm not going to go with you. And the girlfriend got picked up by somebody who murdered her. So she blamed herself for that. She thought if she was there, she wouldn't have been dead. But we worked with that one too.
How do you think that you got the ability to have that initial connection with Jesus in the first place?
It's interesting. As a child, I always thought I was adopted because I never fit in. I would I would run and with the rabbits and chase rabbits, and I knew exactly where they were going to be. And as a child, I loved animals, and people would bring me hurt animals, and I would put my hands on them and heal them. My mother was very, very, we'll call it psychic. She just knew things. I could never get away with anything. I always got caught if I ever disobeyed her. She always caught me. But I remember being with animals and just putting my hands on and healing animals. People would bring me birds with broken wings or, dogs with injured legs. And I wanted to be a veterinarian. In fact, I did all the prerequisites to go to veterinarian school, to go to UC Davis. I did feeds and feeding, beef production, swine production, all the different, pre-vet courses. But I couldn't get into UC Davis monetarily, financially, or yeah. So I ended up becoming a nurse instead. I never thought I would. I never thought I would be a nurse because um, when I was 14, 15 years old, there was a man that kind of became like a surrogate father to me. My dad was always working. And this man took me in as like his daughter. He had three sons, and he owned a little ranchette, and he had horses. And one day I went over, I must have been probably 14, and said, "Hey, I can train that horse for you, that yearling for you." And he said, "You can train horses?" I said, "Sure can." And so he let me, train the horse, and we became friends. And he really liked me, and he'd buy me saddles and bridle. "What do you need, honey? What do you need?" And he was just like, I was the daughter he didn't have, and he had three sons who were kind of little monsters. Anyway, one day I was walking up to the house, to the ranch to go ride the horse, and I hear his oldest son screaming at him, "No, Dad, don't do this, don't do this." And I'm like, "Oh my God." And I get up to the house, and all of a sudden, bam, I hear this gunshot. And I run to the door and I open it up, and Mike says, "Don't come in, don't come in." Lloyd just shot himself, and he shot himself in the head. And he was still alive, and the ambulance came and took him to the hospital. And I walked into the hospital and I passed out. I couldn't be in the hospital. I was like, I couldn't be in the hospital. But of course I was pretty traumatized because he was like a dad to me. But I never thought I'd be a nurse. I never wanted to be a nurse.
If you had a friend that was grieving over the loss of a loved one,
Mm.
what kind of advice would you give?
Well, actually, it's interesting because I was with, I work with, I work with a lot of naturopaths and functional medicine doctors with my other business, and we have a device called the Awakened Mind headset, and it decreases depression, clinically proven 71%, anxiety, stress, 48%, 68%. And it's just an amazing device. So Dr. Carol Petherbridge says to me, "Anita, I have someone who's in really, really, really deep need. So can you come over and put her on the headset and help her get through this grief? She lost her husband a year ago, and she said she's so, so, so depressed." And I went over and I met with the patient, and we talked. And I let her know, I said, her name was Jan. And I said, "Jan," I said, "I've been on the other side." And I said, "There's nothing to fear." I said, "I know you miss your husband terribly. I mean, I would too if my husband died. I would miss him terribly. But I can tell you, he's bathed in love. He's happy. He's filled with joy. He's doing what he wants to do. And I said, and he'll come to you if you ask him to. And I said, do you talk with him at all? Do you ever sense him? And she says, yeah, I do. And so we we talked quite a bit more and kind of lifted her up a little bit. But I think more than anything, because I've been nursing in acute care in a hospital for many, many years. And what after the near-death experience, I helped so many people cross over. I worked in the emergency room and trauma center. And so people who knew me, knew I had died and come back because it kind of spread like wildfire amongst all the ERs in the area. I was very involved in a big trauma center and teaching paramedics. And I know what I left out. I have to tell you one other thing. So
Right?
when I died, my husband at the time was he had been with LAPD for 8.5 years, and then he switched over to the fire department and became a paramedic. But during his time as LAPD, we knew tons of policemen. And so when I was dying, when they called the family conference and they wanted to pull the plug, he called up his friend that was on patrol that day, and he said, I need you to put out over the loudspeaker, over the whole LAPD, to pray for Anita. And so he did. He did. He put it out over the loudspeaker while he was on duty to all of LAPD to pray for me. And I have to tell you, I felt that pulling me back, pulling me back. And I was like, oh my God, they need me back. They need me back. It was so profound. So I always tell people that prayers work.
What did it feel like?
Oh, I could feel like people like pulling me, just like, of course, I wasn't in a body, I was on the other side, but I felt this pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling in this love, like, come on back, come on back, come on back. And I'm like, no, I hadn't seen my whole life flash before my eyes just yet. But no, it was, I didn't find out until later. I was telling my husband how I felt being like I was being pulled back by people, here on the planet. And I didn't really want to come back. So, but yeah, that's when he told me what happened. And I said, oh, well, that makes so much sense. That everybody was, a very large group of people were praying for me to live.
Did you ever tell the staff at the hospital that you had an NDE?
Oh, I talked about it with actually I was going to write a book. I had started writing the book just prior to COVID coming in, and I had contacted Dr. Beck was my pulmonologist, and Dr. Ito was my internist, and I had called them both. I got a hold of both of them and said, I'm going to write a book about my near-death experience, and I want to interview you and make sure that I get all the details right. But then COVID hit. So I got about, one chapter written. It's, yeah, I got about one chapter written and then I just let it go. I stopped. So yeah, so Dr. Beck, he saved my life. That man is like, he's an angel. He really did save my life. And he really was curious. I mean, he was very open to hearing about my experience. And he was curious about what it felt like to be intubated. He goes, I've never asked anybody, what does it feel like to have a tube in your lungs? And I said, oh, every time you put that suction down the tube, it's like electrical shock in your belly, at the base. It's just like this electrical shock in your whole chest. I said, it's horrible. And I don't think you need to suction people as often as you do. And but he was very, very interested in the near-death experience. Yeah, I shared it with him, shared it with Dr. Ito, of course, all my nursing friends. Yeah, yeah. But I'll tell you one thing. I had one woman who was dying at home. Her husband was a friend of mine, and he said, Anita, will you come over? And my wife is hanging on, and she promised me she wouldn't go before Christmas. And he said, the thing is, he says, I can't take it anymore. And she's just in so much pain. I can't take her suffering. He said, will you come over and talk with her and see if maybe you can, share your near-death experience with her? And so I did. It was about 2 weeks before Christmas, and she promised him she wouldn't leave before Christmas. And I sat down with her, and she was unconscious, but I knew she could hear me. I held her hand, and just told her, I want to share what it's like on the other side with you, so you're not afraid. And I shared everything with her, and I went home. That was about 5 o'clock in the evening, and then I went home, and the next day, my friend called me and said she passed at about 3 in the morning.
Do you fear death at all?
Oh, hell no. No, not at all. No, but I gotta tell you something. When I was on the other side, I was just a point of awareness. I was everything and nothing. I was everything. I mean, everything was me. And I wasn't a me. I was just a point of awareness. I was just pure awareness. I gotta tell you something. Having a body is a lot of fun. You don't get the touchy-feely and the taste of chocolate on the other side. You don't get, to make love with your husband or your wife or your significant other. You don't get to do that when you're not in a body. A body is kind of cool. Now, I'd never be afraid to die. No. The process of dying was sucky. Having a fever of 105 and being on an ice mattress with ice in my armpits and groin and everywhere. They were trying to get the fever down. It wouldn't come down. Yeah, that was sucky. That part, the part of the dying with the physical illness at the time, that was hard.
Do you think that the pleasure outweighs the suffering of life, and that's what keeps us coming back over and over again?
Mm. I I truly believe being in a body is a gift. I really truly believe that it's a gift when you can be living from that place of peace, joy, love, but not when you're contracted in anger, fear, guilt, all of the negative emotions, all of the stuff and the baggage that we carry with us. That keeps us from being alive. And that's what my work is about. It's about helping people realize that, this is just so temporary. I mean, every day that I wake up, I'm in so much gratitude that I'm still in my body. Actually, I'm loving my body and I have a second husband, and he's a beautiful man who I believe he's self-realized, and he did Zen Buddhism for 35 years. And he's kind of the middle ground, and we have a beautiful life. I mean, we love each other. We have a beautiful life. I'm living in my childhood dream home. I'm living on 3 acres in a pine forest in a lodge home. And I've never been happier in my life. I've never been happier. But I have to tell you, it takes a lot of work to release the ego, totally surrender. And there's times I'm not totally surrendered, but most of the time I'm in gratitude and I'm loving life and I'm having fun, because this is fun here. I mean, it's kind of like Disney. I call where I live the adult Disneyland because I live in a resort town, and we have hiking and kayaking and camping and biking and rock climbing and horses and everything, animals. I mean, I have deer and buck on my property. And I mean, I live, I think I'm Snow White. I live in an adult Disneyland. I've never been happier. Never. Yeah.
Can you give us tips to live in bliss and not in fear and guilt and shame?
It's an inward facing journey. We are what we're seeking. So many people are looking for a band-aid. If I make more money, I'll be happy. If I have a better car, better clothes, better boyfriend, better husband. They're chasing, constantly chasing. What's out there? What's out there? But it's not until you turn around and relax into God that you understand and get a sense of what it is to just to let go. It's really about, you hear people talk all the time. It's about peeling away the layers of the onion. But in the work that I do, I think what I find is the most troublesome for people is that, we get programmed with these beliefs and these concepts and these fears and these, um, we get told this is how you have to be. And, when we're children between 0 and 7, that's when all the programs come in. And, oh, ye become as little children, and ye will enter the kingdom of heaven. And that's how my husband and I live. It's like we're like two children living in Disneyland. But you've got to, for me, the power of the work that comes through me is that we get to shine the light of each person's own awareness and look at where it is, where they got stuck, where they got blocked, where they created a belief about themselves that is not true. It always boils down to I'm not good enough, I'm not, I'm not enough, right? I'm not pretty enough, my daddy doesn't love me enough. It's this I'm not enough. And we all get it from our parents and our grandparents and our churches and our schools. And we all get these programs, and we're just programmed. And you just have to delete the programs. And when you clear away the programs and you can shine the light of your own awareness into your heart and gut brain, into the deep, deep places where love is so pure and joy is always there, because it's our boundless nature of being, to be joyful, to be happy, to be at peace. I mean, that's our natural way of being. And it just kind of got beat out of us over the years as we grew up.
Anita, after watching this podcast, people may have questions for you.
Mm.
Are you open to that? And if so, how do they contact you?
I am more than happy to answer questions. And if somebody wants to text me one on my telephone, I'm happy to either give out the number here or you can list it. How would you like to do that? And if they text me, then I can reach out to them and find the best way to connect. I do have a Facebook page. I have a website called Bridges of the Heart. And my tagline is the longest bridge a man will cross is from his head to his heart. And so it's www.bridgesoftheheart.com. And then I think if someone wants to text me, then I can get their contact information. And I can reach back out to them and see what it is they have questions, or, you know, I do have clients that I work with long distance. Energy medicine is not stopped by distance. Um, yeah, so thank you.
What is your number?
So my number is area code 541-848-7938. So it's 541-848-7938. And just a text, and I'm on Pacific Standard Time.
Before we finish up, can you leave us with one last positive message?
Never give up hope. Never give up hope. Find your answer. Find what works for you. There's many, many, many paths to self-realization, to knowing who you are. And I've tried many to get there. I've done Science of Mind, Course in Miracles. I've studied with gurus. I've studied, and I think the bottom line is there's always a way to find that peace and that absolute joy, and where you love your life and where you live in gratitude for being in a body.
Anita, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Oh, I'm so honored to be here, Jeff. I so appreciate what you do and the information you bring forth for the many. I really appreciate what you do. You're an angel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.